A boot kicked the door open. Wood cracked against stone. A girl screamed and scrambled into the corner, dragging a chain with her. A man grabbed her by the hair and yanked her off the floor. She bit down on his hand and he struck her across the face. Blood ran from her cracked lip and dripped onto the stone. A dog lunged from the shadows, teeth bared, and clamped down on the man's arm until he howled. 2 more men rushed in with ropes. They dragged her toward the door while the dog fought every step. Her name was Elena Wren, and she was 17, and every man in that room had been sent to find her. Some to save her, some to silence her. What waited behind the great oak doors of Ravenscar Hall would break a hardened Duke to his knees. Stay with me on this one. The Duke had not slept in 4 days. His men had ridden out across 3 counties, and every night they came back with nothing. He stood at the tall window of Ravenscar Hall and watched the road until his eyes burned. Every set of hoofbeats made him turn. Every time it was the wrong rider, and every time something in his chest tightened a little harder. His name was Alaric Thornberry, and men were afraid of him. You could see it in the way the servants pressed themselves flat against the walls when he passed. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a scar that ran from his ear down to his jaw. He had come back from the war a harder man than he'd left. He did not smile. He did not raise his voice because he never had to. When the Duke spoke, people moved. Now here's the thing you have to understand about him. For years he had told himself one lie. He told himself the girl was safe. His old friend, a soldier named Colonel Wren, had died on a battlefield in Spain with the Duke's own hand pressed to his chest. And the colonel had asked him one thing, just one. "Look after my daughter, Alaric, promise me." And the Duke had promised. He'd sworn it while the man's blood ran through his fingers. Then he had come home. He had buried himself in the running of the estate, and he had let other men handle the small, quiet business of a child he had never even met. He sent money. He signed papers. He trusted the arrangements. The girl had been placed with a family called the Harlows, distant relations who ran a large household 2 days' ride to the north. Respectable people on paper, good, church-going people on paper. The Duke had never once gone to see her, not once in 10 years. That was the thing that would come back to haunt him. He had made a promise to a dying man, and then he had turned that promise into a line in a ledger book. And a ledger asks nothing of a man. A ledger doesn't look you in the eye. It was easy, so terribly easy, to let a signature stand in for a visit, and a bank draft stand in for love. Every quarter he signed, and every quarter he told himself he'd ride north come spring. Spring came 10 times, and 10 times something on the estate held him, or so he let himself believe. The truth was simpler and worse. He was afraid to meet the child of the man he'd watched die. So he stayed away, and he called his cowardice good management. Then, 4 days ago, a letter came. It wasn't from the Harlows. It was from a country doctor, a nervous man who wrote in a shaking hand. He wrote that he had been called to the Harlow house to treat a servant girl. A girl kept in the cellars. A girl with old breaks in her fingers and new bruises on her arms, who flinched when he lifted his hand to check her eyes. And when he'd asked her name quietly so the housekeeper couldn't hear, she'd whispered 2 words to him. Elena Wren. The doctor had done the arithmetic. He knew the name Wren. He knew the girl was supposed to be a ward, not a servant. And he was afraid of what he'd stumbled into, so he wrote to the one man with the power to do something. He wrote to the Duke. Alaric had read that letter 3 times. Then he had gone very still. The kind of still that made a room go cold. The steward who brought the letter said afterward that he'd never been so frightened in his life, and the Duke hadn't so much as looked at him. He just stood there with the paper in his hand, and something behind his eyes was breaking apart, quiet and slow, like ice going out on a river. "Bring her to me," the Duke said. "Bring her home, whatever it costs, whoever stands in your way." And his men rode out. But here's what the Duke didn't know yet. The Harlows had heard the doctor was talking, and they had already begun to move the girl, because a girl kept in a cellar for 10 years knows things. She knows which lords never came to visit. She knows whose money bought her silence. And a girl like that, if she ever reached someone who'd listen, could burn a whole family to the ground. So it became a race. The Duke's riders on one side, the Harlow's men on the other, and a half-starved girl in the middle, worth more dead to some men than alive. The one thing nobody counted on was the dog. A great scarred wolfhound named Barnaby, ribs showing through his coat, one ear torn half away. He had been the girl's only friend in that house. Years back he'd been a hunting dog, until he grew too old and slow to earn his keep, and the Harlows had meant to drown him. It was Alina, a small thing herself then, who'd hidden him and shared her scraps with him in the dark. So the two broken creatures had kept each other alive. When the Harlows tried to load her into a cart in the night, Barnaby had torn into them like something out of a nightmare, and in the confusion the Duke's men had found the house. That was the moment you saw at the very start. The door, the chain, the blood. By the time they had her in the carriage, the Harlows' men had scattered into the dark. And the girl who had never once in 10 years been called by her true name was on the road, at last, to Ravenscar Hall. The carriage rolled through the gates just after midnight. The Duke was already at the doors. He had been standing there for hours and the cold hadn't moved him an inch. They opened the carriage, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then a low growl rolled out of the dark inside. Barnaby's head appeared first, teeth bared, putting himself between the men and the girl behind him. One of the guards reached for his sword. The Duke lifted a single hand and the guard froze. Slowly the girl came into the light of the doorway, and the whole yard went quiet. She was small, far too small for 17. Her wrists were like reeds. Her face was hollowed out with hunger and one cheek was swollen dark from where she'd been struck. She wore a servant's rough dress, filthy and torn. She held the wolfhound's collar with both hands, not to control him but to hold herself up. And her eyes. That was what stopped every man there. Her eyes moved across all of them, waiting to see which one would hit her first. She wasn't hoping to be saved. She'd stopped hoping for that a long time ago. She was just trying to guess where the next blow would come from. The Duke came down the steps. Big as he was in his dark coat, he must have looked like death itself coming toward her. She shrank back against the carriage wheel. Barnaby's growl climbed into a snarl and the great dog put himself square in front of her, ready to die. Every guard tensed. A dog like that could tear a man's throat out. Somebody muttered to put it down. The Duke stopped. Then, in front of all his men, in the cold and the mud, the Duke of Ravenscar lowered himself down. He knelt in the wet rushes of his own courtyard. He didn't reach for the girl. He didn't reach for the dog. He just went down onto one knee so that he was smaller than her, and he held out his open hand to the wolfhound. "Steady," he said, and his voice wasn't the voice the servants knew. It was quiet, gentle. "Steady, boy, I'm not going to hurt her. Not ever again." Barnaby's snarl faltered. The dog sniffed the offered hand, hackles still up, unsure. And the girl watched, confused, because in her whole life no big man had ever knelt down to her. They only ever loomed over her. The Duke lifted his eyes to her face, and that was when he saw it. Not the servant, not the stranger. He saw the shape of an old friend in her jaw, in the set of her brow. He saw Colonel Wren looking back at him out of a starved and beaten child, and the promise he had made on a battlefield 10 years before came crashing down on him all at once. The hard man of Ravenscar, the man who never wept, felt his face break. He knelt there in the mud in front of everyone, and his shoulders shook. "Alina," he whispered. "God forgive me." Alina. She didn't understand. How could she? But something in the way he said her name, her real name, cracked something open in her. Her legs gave out, and the Duke caught her before she hit the ground, and he held her, this stranger, this trembling bundle of bones, as if she were made of glass. Barnaby pressed against them both and stopped growling, and the whole courtyard stood in silence, watching their master weep over a servant girl. He carried her inside himself. He wouldn't let anyone else touch her. For 2 days the hall held its breath. The Duke had the finest room prepared, the one that caught the morning sun. He sent for the doctor, the same nervous man whose letter had started it all, and paid him 10 times his fee. Broth was brought up every few hours, warm water, clean linen. Barnaby was allowed to sleep on the foot of the bed, and any servant who objected was told, very calmly, to find work elsewhere. Elinor slept for most of the first day. When she woke, she flinched at everything. A dropped spoon, a raised voice down the hall. She hid food under her pillow, the way you do when you've learned that meals can be taken away. The Duke saw it, and he said nothing, and he simply made sure more food kept coming until she understood it wouldn't stop. He sat with her for hours. He didn't push. He told her small things. He told her about her father, the colonel, how the man had laughed too loud and sung badly and carried a lock of his baby daughter's hair in his coat until the day he died. He told her the colonel had once run into cannon fire to carry a wounded stranger to safety, and had never once mentioned it after, because to him it wasn't a story worth telling. Elinor listened to all of it with wide, careful eyes. She had never known a single thing about the man who made her. The Harlows had told her she was a foundling. Nobody. Less than nobody. "You are the daughter of a hero," the Duke told her, "and you are under my roof now. And I swear to you, on his grave, no one will ever lay a hand on you again." By the third morning, something had eased. Elinor sat up on her own. She ate at the table by the window slowly, and she let a maid brush the tangles from her hair without shaking. Color was coming back into her face. She even once almost smiled when Barnaby stole a piece of bread off her plate and looked terribly proud of himself. The Duke stood in the doorway and watched her sit in the sunlight, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt the weight come off his chest. He let himself believe it was over. The worst was behind them. He had found her, he had saved her, and now they would simply heal. He went down to his study, poured himself a drink, and sat back in his chair. The danger, he thought, was past. He was wrong. A fist pounded on the great oak doors, not a knock. A pounding, hard and official, the kind that expects to be answered. The Duke came out onto the landing. His steward was already at the doors, and standing in the cold morning light on the threshold was a man in a black coat with a chain of office around his neck. Behind him, 6 armed men, and beside him, smiling thinly, stood a heavy-set gentleman the Duke had never met but somehow already hated. The man in black held up a rolled paper with a wax seal. "I am the magistrate of this county," he announced, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "I am here on a sworn complaint. A young woman named Elinor Wren, a ward lawfully in the care of the Harlow family, has been taken from her home by force, and the man who ordered it taken," the magistrate looked up the stairs straight at the Duke, "is standing right there. You see how the whole thing turned in a single breath. A moment ago this was a rescue. A moment ago the Duke was the hero of it. Now, with one sealed paper, he was the accused, because the Harlows hadn't run. They'd done something far more dangerous. They'd gone to the law first, and the law in 1817 did not belong to beaten servant girls. It belonged to families with money and names and papers. The heavy-set man stepped forward. "Silas Harlow," he said smoothly, "the girl's guardian, and I'm afraid, Your Grace, that you have been most cruelly deceived." He let the words hang. "This poor creature is not well in her mind. She harms herself. Those bruises, those breaks, she does them to herself in her fits. We have cared for her for 10 years out of Christian duty at great cost to ourselves. And now you've stolen her and filled her head with wild stories." He shook his head, sorrowful as a priest. "The marks on her, Your Grace. A court will ask who put them there, and you are the one holding her behind locked doors." There it was. The trap sprung clean. Silas Harlow wasn't just trying to get the girl back. He was turning the crime around. If Aliner's bruises came to court, he would swear they were fresh and that the Duke had made them. The very evidence of her suffering would be twisted into a rope around Alaric's neck, and a girl who flinched and hid food and couldn't meet a stranger's eye would make a poor witness against a smiling, respectable man with a magistrate in his pocket. And I'll tell you what made it worse. The magistrate wasn't even a wicked man. He was just a small one. He owed the Harlows a favor or two, the way small men in the country always owe the big families around them, and he'd learned long ago that a wise man doesn't cross the people who keep him fed. So he came ready to believe Silas, because believing Silas was easier and safer. That's how the powerful get away with it, not by buying monsters. By leaning on ordinary frightened men who'd rather look away. The Duke stood very still on the landing, and I'll tell you that stillness was more frightening than any shout. "You will not take her," he said. The magistrate lifted his paper. "I have a lawful order, and I have 300 years of Ravenscar behind these walls," the Duke answered, coming down one slow step at a time. "You may bring your order through my doors, sir, but you will not bring it past me." Now, before I tell you what the Duke did next, because believe me, this is where it turns, let me say one thing. If you're still with me, if this story's got its hand around your heart the way it's got mine, do me a small kindness and hit that subscribe button. That's all. It helps more than you know, and it keeps stories like this one coming. Now, let's get back to that hall and to the smiling man who thought he'd already won. The Duke did not have them thrown out. That's what Silas expected. He expected rage, a scuffle, something a magistrate could write down. Instead, the Duke did something colder. He invited them in. "Come," he said, "sit. Warm yourselves. Let us discuss this like gentlemen." Silas Harlow smiled, thinking he had the man rattled. They came into the great hall, and while they settled by the fire, the Duke sent one quiet word up the stairs with a trusted maid. Not for the girl, for the doctor, and for a locked box in the Duke's study that held every letter, every payment, every receipt of the last 10 years. Here is what Silas Harlow did not know. The Duke had spent those 3 quiet days doing more than sitting at a bedside. He had written letters of his own, sent riders of his own, and begun to pull very gently on a thread. He had sent a man to the bank in town, and another to ask quiet questions in the village near the Harlow house, and the thread had started to unravel a great deal. "Your accounts, your grace," the magistrate began, but the Duke raised a hand. "Before we speak of law," the Duke said, "let us speak of arithmetic." He set the box on the table. "For 10 years I have sent £40 a quarter for the care, feeding, schooling, and clothing of my ward." He lifted a stack of receipts, signed for, every one, by you, Mr. Harlow. £40 a quarter is a gentleman's living. It would keep a young lady in silk. He let a receipt fall to the table, so I find myself asking, where did it go? Because it did not go on the child. I have seen the child. She weighs less than my hounds. Silas's smile stiffened just slightly. "And I asked the good doctor here to examine her injuries with care," the Duke went on. The doctor, sitting pale in the corner, nodded. "Some of those breaks in her fingers are years old," the doctor said quietly, "healed crooked. No child does that to herself, sir. Those were done by a grown hand and done more than once over a long time." He swallowed, "and the fear in her. I have treated frightened patients my whole life. That is not madness. That is a person who has been hurt on purpose, again and again, until she expects nothing else." The room went very quiet. The magistrate shifted in his seat, and you could see him beginning to wonder which side of this he wanted to be on. He'd come to do a favor for a friend. He hadn't come to hang his name on the starving of a child. But Silas Harlow was not a stupid man, and cornered men are dangerous. "You can prove nothing," he said, and his voice had lost its silk. "Your word against mine. Receipts prove I fed her, not starved her. A doctor's guess is not evidence. And the girl." He smiled again, thin and cruel. "The girl will say whatever you tell her to say, poor mad thing. Bring her down. Let her try to speak against me. Let us all watch her fall to pieces. And that was his mistake. Because the Duke had never once said he intended to make Alina speak. There will be no need, the Duke said, to trouble the young lady. He turned toward the stairs. Because someone else in your house grew a conscience, Mr. Harlow, someone who could not sleep with what she'd seen. A door opened at the top of the stairs, and down came a woman in a plain gray dress, twisting her apron in her hands. A servant, one of the Harlows' own. Sela's went white as bone. Her name was Martha. She had been the cook in the Harlow house for 20 years. She had watched Alina grow up in that cellar. For years, she'd been too frightened to do anything but slip the child an extra crust when no one was watching, and she carried that shame like a stone. But when the Duke's riders had come, and the household scattered, Martha had made her choice at last. She had climbed into the very carriage that carried Alina away, and no one had noticed one more frightened woman in the dark. She had been in Ravenscar Hall for 3 days, and she had told the Duke everything. She told it again now in front of the magistrate, in a voice that shook but did not stop. She told how Silas Harlow himself had struck the child. How he'd locked her in the cellar for days without food when she wept too loud. How the money came every quarter and went straight onto Silas's card tables and his mistress in town, while the girl wore rags. And how just 5 nights ago she'd heard Silas tell his men that the doctor was talking, and that it would be cleaner if the girl were found drowned in the mill pond than found alive. That last part landed like a hammer. Even the magistrate stood up. Silas Harlow lost his temper. That was the end of him, really. He surged out of his chair, red-faced, roaring that Martha was a lying servant, that the Duke had bought her, that he'd see them all ruined. And in his rage, he made his final error. He turned toward the stairs, toward the room where the girl lay, and he snarled that he'd drag the mad little wretch out himself and show them all what she was. He took 2 steps toward those stairs, and the Duke moved. You have to remember what the Duke was underneath the title. He was a soldier, a big one, and 10 years of guilt had just found somewhere to go. He crossed the hall before anyone could blink and caught Silas Harlow by the front of his fine coat and lifted him clean off his feet. Silas's men reached for their weapons. Barnaby came down the stairs like gray thunder and put himself in front of them, and the Duke's own guards drew steel, and the whole room hung on the edge of blood. "Look at me," the Duke said, and Silas, dangling in that iron grip, looked. "You put your hands on a child," the Duke said, low and terrible, and every man in that hall heard it. "A child that a dying man begged me to protect. You starved her. You broke her fingers, and you were going to drown her in a pond and call it an accident." He drew Silas close until they were nose to nose. "And you walked into my house, and you called it Christian duty." Silas Harlow, brave enough to beat a girl half his size, found he had nothing at all to say to the man holding him off the floor. The Duke did not kill him. I'll be honest, part of me wanted him to, and part of the Duke wanted to. You could see it in his hands. But he set Silas Harlow down instead, very slowly, and he turned to the magistrate and he asked one simple question. "Sir, you came here for a criminal." He nodded at Silas. "There he stands. The receipts, the doctor, the witness. 10 years of theft and the attempted murder of a nobleman's ward. Now, whose word will you take?" And the magistrate, who had come to arrest a duke, and now saw the whole thing turned inside out, looked at the pale, sweating, guilty face of Silas Harlow, and made the only choice a man who wanted to keep his post could make. He took Silas Harlow into custody there in the great hall. The armed men who'd come with him laid down their arms, because not one of them was willing to hang for Silas. And they dragged Silas out through the great oak doors he'd walked in so proud of, and he was screaming the whole way. And this time the girl was the one safe inside, and the cruel man was the one being pulled out into the cold. It was quiet in Ravenscar Hall after that. The good kind of quiet. Silas Harlow was tried at the county assizes that spring. Martha spoke. The doctor spoke. The receipts spoke loudest of all. Elinor never had to stand up in that courtroom, never had to look at his face again, because the Duke had built the case so that she wouldn't have to. Silas was found guilty of theft and of the attempt on her life, and he was sent away in irons, and the Harlow name, once so respectable on paper, became a thing people whispered with disgust. The Duke saw to it that Martha the cook never wanted for work or a home again. But those are just the facts of it. The part that matters happened slower and quieter over the months that followed. Elinor healed, not all at once. Healing like that doesn't come all at once, and anyone who's carried a hurt a long time knows it. There were nights she still woke screaming. There were days she still hid bread in her sleeve out of an old habit she couldn't unlearn. For a long while she flinched when the Duke came near, because her body remembered what big men had always meant. And the Duke, this hard soldier who had never had the patience for anything, learned patience. He never once let it show if it hurt him when she pulled away. He just stayed. He was simply, quietly, always there until her body learned a new thing, that this big man meant safety. He gave her a proper room, filled with books, because he learned she'd taught herself to read in secret by candle stubs in that cellar. He brought tutors. Not to fix her, he told them, just to open doors and let her walk through the ones she wanted. She had a quick, hungry mind under all that fear. Within a year she was reading faster than her tutors. Within 2 she was arguing with the Duke about history at his own dinner table, and he loved it. Believe me, nothing made that grim man happier than being argued with by that girl. Barnaby, the old wolfhound, lived out his days by the great fire of Ravenscar Hall, fat and slow and adored, the most spoiled dog in 3 counties. He'd earned it. He had been her whole family when she had no one, and the Duke never forgot it. When the old dog finally died, years on, he was buried in the garden under a stone, and the stone had his name on it, which is more than most men get. And the Duke, well, he got the thing he never thought he deserved. He got to keep his promise. He formally made Elinor his ward in truth, and then in time his heir. Not out of pity, out of love, the plain, stubborn love a man has for the child he failed and then fought to save. People said all sorts of things about it. He didn't care what people said. He'd stopped caring about that in the mud of his own courtyard, the night he knelt down in front of everyone and wept. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Years later, a traveler came to Ravenscar Hall on a winter night and pounded on those great oak doors, cold and lost and asking for shelter. And the young woman of the house came out herself to answer it. She was tall now and steady, and there was no fear left in her eyes. She opened the door wide to a frightened stranger in the dark, and she brought him in from the cold, and she fed him at her own table, and she made sure no one would ever turn him away. You remember how this story started. A door kicked open, a girl in a corner waiting for the blow, a world where the strong took whatever they wanted from the weak and called it their right. And here was the same girl, grown, opening a door of her own free will to let the cold and the frightened come in from the dark. That was what the Duke gave her in the end. Not just a rescue, not just revenge, though he gave her that too. He gave her the chance to become the kind of person who opens doors instead of the kind who cowers behind them. He took the worst thing that ever happened to her, and he stood between her and the world until she was strong enough to stand there herself. Some men carry a power that has nothing to do with muscle. It's the power to kneel down, to go smaller so a frightened child can feel bigger, to say I'm sorry and mean it, and then spend the rest of your life proving it. The Duke of Ravenscar was the hardest man in 3 counties. And the strongest thing he ever did was get down on one knee in the mud and weep and hold out his hand. That's the whole story. And I think, if her father the colonel could have seen it, he'd have said his friend kept the promise after all. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end.